In this walkthrough, I'm going to go through a little more than what's in the lab just to give you guys some extra background as I go. So the first thing you're going to want to do on each of your servers is connect to the TARDIS share. And so we're going to connect to the TARDIS share, which is the / 10.10.0.190 / TARDIS. Going to enter the appropriate password or user ID and password, and so that you can grab out a canvas. We're going to do the same thing over on Saturn and also on Jupiter. So we want to connect to TARDIS on all three of those. And if you aren't sure what the credentials are, there is the supplemental FAQ in the weekly announcement or weekly course opening, and /student with a E instead of a 3, or a 3 instead of an E for student, and then the password. And the password for that is capital TR1PP uppercase L1T3. And then the files that we need are under SQL. So we're going to copy the Ssms, which is the SQL Server Management Studio file. We're going to just bring that to our downloads folder initially. And we're going to make sure that we bring that down to Remus, Saturn, and Jupiter. So we're going to bring SQL Server Management Studio to those 3 servers. And so we'll just follow the same process on each server. So right click on Network, Map Network Drive. I'm going to put in the path to TARDIS, select connect as a different credential, finish, and then enter our /student and the password. And go to TARDIS, go to SQL, grab the file, copy, throw it into downloads. And we'll do the same thing on Jupiter. And so SQL Management Server only exists for Windows. It does not exist for Linux. So for our Linux server, we can connect from SQL Management Studio on Windows. We just can't actually install it on the Linux server itself. We can only connect to the Linux server using it. So now that we've got it downloaded to all of our servers, our next step is we're going to go and actually install SQL Server Management Studio. First, we're going to install it on Jupiter. And it's just a straightforward installer. Just click Install. It does take a while for the installer to run. Okay, once it's installed, you're going to want to restart your server. Well, actually, that's right. Don't have to necessarily restart the server. Forgot about that. And so we're on Jupiter. And so the server type, database engine, you don't need to touch. Server name is what we want to connect to. And in this case, I'm going to just do a demo of connecting to our Linux, which is Vulkan, which is 192.168.79.50, using SQL authentication, using the SQL administrator account, which is SA, and then the password that I set up on the Linux box when I installed SQL Server on my Linux box. And when you connect to the SQL instance on Linux, you'll see a little penguin next to the database, and you'll be able to connect there. So So then if you wanted to run a query, which we'll be doing in some future labs, you just click on the new query button. And in this particular one, we're just going to do a quick query to see what databases are in our server. This part's not in your lab. This is just some extra stuff that I'm adding in here to give you some more content. So we're doing a select statement. And we're going to select name. From sys.databases. And then we're going to select the execute button, and that'll return what databases are currently on the system. So it's a really quick little SQL query to actually see what databases currently exist on a system. Now to make a database, we can just right click, say new database, and then we're going to give a database a name. So in this particular case, we're just going to call it Airglow, and then just say OK. Then we can expand the database folder, and there's our Airglow database. Now if we want to get rid of that database, all we have to do is right click on that database, select delete, and OK. And our database is gone. So it's really easy to set up a new database and also really easy to delete a database. And then if you want to see what's happening on your system, you can go into Activity Monitor. So we just right-clicked on the server, we selected Activity Monitor, and it takes a little bit for the data to actually start showing up, but we can expand each of the fields, processes, resource weights, data file I/O, recent expansive queries, and active expansive queries. And it'll take about as long as opening them all, and then you're going to start seeing some data showing up, because over time it starts accumulating data once you actually go into it and it starts running. So now we'll scroll up, it'll just take a moment, and now we start seeing data. And so this is how you can take a look and see what's happening on your database as far as processes, how much load is on it, and what's going on at a given point in time on your database. This is just another view. This is another extra bit of content I'm just throwing at you. That's not in the lab per se, but it is content that you're going to want to know about. Okay, so once we've seen how we can connect to a database from Jupyter, now what we're going to do is we're going to go on to Saturn. We're going to install SQL Server Management Studio on Saturn. And we're going to also install SQL Server Management Studio on Remus. So what we're going to do is first we're going to connect locally to make sure that the database is working properly, and we can connect locally and make sure everything is working. Once we get that done, we're going to try connecting remotely from Jupyter to Saturn and Remus. So the install process is identical to what we did on Jupyter. So I won't go into that on this one. We'll sort of basically install it identically like you did on the previous install on Jupyter. It does take about 5 minutes to install on each server. Okay, and then we want to make sure we're logging in as, again, the domain administrator account, so Trantor/administrator with the appropriate password. Same thing on Saturn. Start. And SQL Server Tools, SQL Server Management Studio, can let that start running. While that's loading, we're going to then go into SQL Configuration Manager, and we just want to check some settings. And Configuration Manager will be under Microsoft SQL Server. It's the one with the red toolbox. And so what we want to do is we're going to look at SQL Server Services. And see what state the various services are in. And we can see that the SQL Server service is running, which is what we need to connect to. The SQL Server agent and the SQL Server browser are not running. In the next week's lab, we'll be dealing with the SQL Server agent, but for right now, we don't need to worry about it. Now let's double check our networking, go to protocols, and you'll see that TCP/IP is currently in a disabled state. And what that means is we won't be able to connect to it from another server. We'll only be able to connect to it locally unless we enable that. Click Apply and OK. And so now we're done with SQL Server Configuration Manager. And we're going to go to SQL Management Studio. So on Saturn, since we installed that with the GUI, there we go. Back to, we're going to be able to connect using Windows Authentication. And with Windows Authentication, it takes the user you're currently logged in as and uses that and passes that through for your authentication. So it should be, if everything was set up properly on your server, that you should just be able to select Connect and be able to connect right in using Windows Authentication locally on Saturn to connect using SQL Management Studio. So we'll disconnect. We're going to select Connect again, Database Engine. We're going to switch it to SQL Authentication. Login is always going to be SA, which is our SQL administrator account, and then the SA password that we set initially when we built our Saturn server. And as long as everything is set up properly, we should be able to log in, and you can see there that SA is who we're logged in as. Now we're going to repeat this process on Remus, which is the one that we use the scripted install on. And most likely because you use the scripted install, things may be a little different. Protocols, we need to make sure we enable TCP/IP so that we can actually connect from a different server. You'll still be able to connect locally if you didn't enable TCP/IP, but our next step after we do this, we're going to go over to Jupyter and connect to these servers as well. So we're going to launch SQL Management Studio again, and this time again we're on Remus. And we're going to do SQL Authentication, SA, and our password. And it's not going to work. And the reason it's not going to work is when we did the scripted install, we may not have actually selected mixed mode when we did our install process. So you should still be able to log in using Windows Authentication. And so what we want to do is make it so we can enable that SA account and mixed mode. So right click on Remus, go to Properties. We're going to go to Security, select SQL Server and Windows Authentication mode. Which is also referred to as mixed mode, and then OK. And then you saw there that in order for that to apply, we have to restart our server. And you'll also notice our SA account is still in a disabled state and we haven't set a password. So we're going to right click on it and we're going to set a password so that we actually know it. And I actually, at this point, forgot a step. So what we're going to have is that so we're restarting the database. So you just right click on the database and you can restart it. But you can see that red X over the SA account over there, and that's going to come back and prevent us from being able to get in the next time. So we're going to switch it over to SQL authentication and try logging in, and unfortunately it's going to fail on us because that account is still in a disabled state. So what we need to do is log back in using Windows authentication. Go into security, go into logins, right click on SA, go to properties, and go to status. And for the login, we need to say enable, and then OK. And then connect to our database engine. Now we can switch it to SQL authentication, SA, and the SA password. And we're in. And you can see there that at the end of the login, it shows what account you're currently logged into the server as. So now we know we can log in locally from Saturn using SQL Management Studio and on Remus from SQL Management Studio. So now what we want to do is connect from Jupyter to Saturn and Jupyter to Remus. So we can close out those screens that we don't need. They aren't in your lab, so you don't have to worry about those. So we're going to select Connect, Database Engine. And for our first one, we're going to connect to Saturn. Oh, actually, I take that back. We're going to connect to Remus. So we're going to connect to remus.trantor.local. And first time we'll connect using Windows Authentication. So switch it over to Windows Authentication and select Connect. And if everything goes right, should just be able to connect, and it'll connect right up. And then we're going to do the same thing to connect to Saturn. But we're going to run into a problem here, and it's not going to allow us to connect. And it's because we did one step differently on Remus than we did on Saturn. On Remus, we restarted the database, and on Saturn, we did not. So that setting when we changed and enabled our TCP/IP stack on Saturn and Remus, because we did not restart the server service on Saturn, we aren't able to connect to it remotely because it's still not allowing that connection. So what we're going to have to do is go over to Saturn, and we're going to have to right click on Saturn, and restart. Oops, not properties. I'm walking through the troubleshooting steps here, so I'm making sure it's enabled. Now I'm going to right click. Nope, I'm actually still just double checking that everything is working as expected. Locally, you can log in as Windows and SQL authentication, but currently we can't connect remotely from Jupyter. And it's still not going to let us because we haven't actually rebooted that server to apply that new running state. Because we made a change to the running state, but we didn't actually apply it. So we're back on Saturn. This is just sort of going through some troubleshooting steps and just making sure, okay, are all the domain firewalls off? Is the name right? Is everything else right? Okay, everything is right. And it hasn't dawned on me yet that I hadn't actually restarted the server service to apply. And I double check to make sure that I'm actually on the internal network. So I'm sort of running around in circles here trying to figure out, so why is this not connecting? And then another way you can try connecting is actually by putting the IP of the server in, rather than the DNS name if DNS is being squirrely. But that's going to fail also because it's actually the server service that we need to restart in order to apply that setting. So we'll go back to Saturn. Go back to SQL Management Studio. Actually, I'm double checking the firewalls because firewalls is another thing that can get in your way. If your firewalls don't have appropriate holes poked, in our case, best bet is to just turn off the firewalls just to make your life easier. If you're poking holes, you'd be poking port 1433. So there's our failure again. So now let's actually fix this so we can connect. So we're going to go back to Saturn. We're going to go to SQL Management Studio. We're going to right click on the database. We're going to, no, we're not there. Now we're going to right click on the database and we're going to select Restart. And it says, are you sure you want to do that? Yes, we are. We want to restart the database because we want to apply the changes to our configuration to the running state. And we'll disconnect and reconnect locally just to make sure all of that's working. Now that we've done that, we can go back to Jupyter and we can select, and we can go DNS name or IP address. We're going to switch it back to DNS name, so saturn.trantor.local. And connect, and boom, connects. Amazing how that works. So what was holding us up is that something as simple as we made a configuration change, but we didn't actually have it in the running config. It was only in the settings that we had made a change. We needed to actually restart the server service to apply that setting of enabling TCP/IP. So now we can connect to all three servers. And this is part of what's sort of cool about SQL Server Management Service is you can actually have multiple databases connected at the same time. So now we're just going to create a new database on Saturn. So you just right click on databases just like I showed initially on Linux, and we create a new database. We'll do the same thing on Remus. And in Lab, slightly different database names that you'll create, and then open that up to see that new database. So now we've created a couple databases on our Remus and Saturn servers. And then now what we want to do is we want to restore a database. So we're going to go to Saturn. We're going to grab another file from TARDIS. And in the revised lab document, I have you doing this in an earlier step. So we're just going to go and grab the worldwideimporters.back database and move that to a local file called c:temp. Okay, so we're going to copy the worldwideimporters.back to our download folder on Saturn. Then we're going to create a folder at the root of C and just call it temp. And then we're going to paste our worldwide importer into that folder. And once we have that done, we're going to go back to Jupyter. And then we're going to go to our connection to Saturn. Restore database. Select device. Select the three dots. Select add. Navigate to ctemp. You'll see our worldwide importers file that we put in there. Select OK. Now we have our path. Select OK. And select OK. Now we'll restore our backup copy of our worldwide importers database into Saturn. And it does take a little while to run. And there's our database restored into Saturn. Now we're going to do the same thing on Remus. So we're going to go to Remus first, go to File Explorer. And this one initially I'm going to show you what happens if you don't move it to a folder. So we're going to go through the whole process, go to TARDIS, grab our file, move it local. We're going to move it to the download folders, and initially we're going to try not creating that ctemp and just trying to find it in the download folders to do our restore. So we're going over to Jupyter. We're going to go to right-click on databases under Remus and restore. Select device, select our three dots, add. And now what we're going to find is we can't find that file because we don't have rights to that user. Because SQL does not have rights to look into the Tranter administrator's download folder, so we can't actually find those files. So what we're going to need to do is go back over to Remus. Here I'm showing that default user download folder doesn't have what we're looking for. So this is why it's important to actually go over to Remus, create that folder that is going to be visible to SQL from, so we're creating our temp folder. And we're going to put a copy of our, so copy that, put it in our temp folder, and then we'll go back over to Jupyter. Now we're going to select add again, and we're going to navigate to the temp folder in our C drive. There's our backup file that we need. Select OK, and our restore will start. Again, it's about a 3-minute restore. And it's been restored successfully, and that's the end of the lab.